Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Cade.
I'm Laura, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking.
In 1991, Ben Okri won the UK's prestigious literary award, the Booker Prize, for his novel The Famished Road. Okri beat a field of 5 other shortlisted authors, none of whom were women, which struck a group of writers, editors and publishers as strange, given that around 60% of books published at that time were by women. In the preceding years, only 10% of novelists shortlisted for the Booker Prize had been women. And so the group decided to do something about it, founding a prize that would celebrate and recognise outstanding fiction written by women. Today, the winner of the Women's Prize receives £30,000 and a statuette known as the Bessie.
In no particular order, this year's shortlisted titles are Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, Pod by Laline Paul, Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, and The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell.
The judges this year are chaired by broadcaster and writer Louise Minchin, a familiar face on British screens from her job anchoring the BBC News. She's joined by Rachel Joyce, a novelist and playwright whose book The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry was a best-selling hit. Next is Vogue columnist Bella Mackie, whose best-selling novel How to Kill Your Family was a Bookstagram favourite in 2021. Then there's Irinosa Nkoje, whose novel Butterfly Fish and short story collections have been highly acclaimed. You may also have heard her co-hosting the BBC's Turn Up for the Books podcast. Finally, Tulip Sadiq is the Member of Parliament for Hampstead and Kilburn here in London, and Shadow Economic Secretary to the Treasury. Her political CV is impressive, but she is also, it turns out, a reader.
A dazzling lineup of cultural figures this may be, but we are no less dazzled to be joined around the podcast table by 2 dear bookish friends. Sarah Oliver's voice will be instantly familiar to regular listeners from previous Booker and Women's Prize episodes, and we're delighted to have her back. Nina Davies, meanwhile, is a book club review first-timer, and we're going to break her in gently.
Announcing the shortlist, Louise Minchin said, "This is an exquisite set of ambitious, diverse, thoughtful, hard-hitting and emotionally engaging novels. A glittering showcase of the power of women's writing. My fellow judges and I feel it has been a huge privilege to read these novels, and we are delighted to be part of their journey, bringing them to the attention of more readers from across the world."
Well, they've brought these books to our attention, we've read them, and we have thoughts to share. We're even going to have a go at predicting the winner.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Nina, Sarah, it's great to have you both here.
Thank you for having us. It's good to be back.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm very excited.
A couple of disclaimers before we start. It's time to bring out my trusty Virginia Woolf quote. She said, "How any woman with a family ever put pen to paper I cannot fathom. Always the bell rings and the baker calls." The same might be true of women reading, women podcasting. I moved house today, so my day has been a bit chaotic. And as a result, instead of recording in a nice, what's the word? A nicely acoustic studio, that's right.
A shed.
We are recording in my incredibly echoey kitchen. So apologies, listeners, if we sound a bit like we're in a tunnel. In the fine tradition of women everywhere around the world, we're all busy managing careers and families and managing to fit in our reading where we can. And so we took a divide and conquer approach to the reading list, with each of the shortlisted novels having been read by at least 2 of us. We've got lots to get through and only Laura's Vancouver lunchtime to do it in, so let's crack on with Demon Copperhead. Set in the mountains of southern Appalachia, Demon Copperhead is the story of the son of a teenage single mother who was born with no assets beyond his dead father's good looks and copper-coloured hair, a quick wit, buckets of charm, and a talent for survival. Taking inspiration from Charles Dickens's classic novel of social injustice, David Copperfield, Barbara Kingsolver sets out to tell the story of a marginalised part of America and the devastating impact of the opioid crisis. The audiobook is read by Charlie Thurston. Here's a clip.
First, I got myself born. A decent crowd was on hand to watch, and they've always given me that much. The worst of the job was up to me, my mother being, let's just say, out of it. On any other day, they'd have seen her outside on the deck of her trailer home, Good neighbors taking notice, pestering the tit of trouble as they will. All through the dog-breath air of late summer and fall. Cast an eye up the mountain, and there she'd be, little bleach blonde smoking her Pall Malls, hanging on that railing like she's captain of her ship up there. And now might be the hour it's going down. This is an 18-year-old girl we're discussing, all on her own and as pregnant as it gets. The day she failed to show, it fell to Nance Peggott to go bang on the door, barge inside and find her passed out on the bathroom floor with her junk all over the place and me already coming out. A slick fish-colored hostage picking up grit from the vinyl tile, worming and shoving around because I'm still inside the sack that babies float in. Pre-real life.
Sarah, Laura, you both read this one, as did I. In an interview I watched with Kingsolver, she said that this story of her home region of Appalachia and the effect that opioid drugs have had on the mostly poor working-class population there is one that she had been struggling to tell for years. And then she visited Dickens's house in Broadstairs, here in the UK, and his ghost appeared to her, apparently, to remind her that he'd done it all before her with his novel, David Copperfield, and she realised there was the structure and framework she had been looking for. Sarah, how did you get on with this contemporary take on a classic?
I really enjoyed it. As you can hear from my voice, I'm American, living in London, where Charles Dickens sets a lot of his stories. And I'm from very close to where Demon Copperhead takes place. So I thought she described the settings and the places and there's one part, I need to look and find the quote, but where she describes, I think it's like coal chutes coming out of a mountainside and he's seeing it and imagining them as water slides. And I have done exactly that thing, seeing exactly that sight as a child. And so I thought she captured the voice of a child really well and the voice of an Appalachian poor child really well. And I just loved it.
It felt like a novel to me that had a really strong sense of place. And I didn't actually know that Kingsolver was from that region, but I sort of assumed it as I was reading it. It just felt so much like a place that she knows really well and understands.
But that's also the thing that she's really good at. Her other novels do that too.
Yes, of course, because she's no stranger to literary prizes, is she? She's the author of 10 previous novels. She won the Pulitzer for The Poisonwood Bible, was it? Which is a fantastic novel set in the Congo.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like, I was surprised by how much I love this and how much it swept me away. But at the same time, I was like, well, you know, she's a really experienced author with a lot of previous form. I shouldn't be so surprised that this is so captivating. Laura, how about you?
Well, I haven't read David Copperfield, but I have read a fair amount of Dickens, and the subject matter of this book is really challenging. There are heartbreaking moments throughout. There's a lot of death and devastation caused by addiction. And yet, Kingsolver does channel Dickens, I think, in the tone that she manages to achieve. So there is this very jaunty pace to the narration that comes across from the very beginning. And even through the devastation, there's humor laced so that you don't get too bogged down. I did step back from the book, I must admit, and then I came back and fully finished it. And things happen at the end that pull the narrative full circle. I won't give too much away there, but I was surprised again by how she had managed to achieve such a gripping, weirdly, use the term jaunty again, narrative around such devastating subject matter.
And Nina, I think you didn't manage to finish it, but you have read some of it.
I have.
What was your feeling about it?
Maybe I'm a slight outlier here, but I didn't love it in the same way that maybe I know all of you did. I found it, maybe because of David Copperfield being in the background of my head, I found it frustrating because the names were very similar. I got a bit distracted by that, who's this in the David Copperfield book? So I found that really difficult. At the same time, I was really taken by the way she described injustice, I guess, especially from the eyes of a child. That was really devastating to read. You go through the book and think, how can this boy's life get any worse? And then, some awful other thing happens. You can predict it, but it's still really hard when it happens. I don't know, I couldn't get super excited, maybe because I was reading it all. Maybe I didn't have a chance to take a step back like Laura did. I was trying to finish it, so I was reading it at a pace. I found the voice strangely odd. Sometimes I thought she got the voice right of the child, and sometimes I found the voice a little bit too grown up for the child he was still meant to be. And I found that a bit tricky.
Well, because it's his coming of age story, isn't it? So we begin, he's born, just as in the Dickens novel, and then we follow him through his childhood and adolescence, and then at the end, he's reached adulthood, with many incident along the way. I mean, the episodic nature of this and the narrative tug had the most powerful effect on me. I not only missed a stop on my tube, I actually wandered onto a completely different line on the network because I was so wrapped up in the idea of the story at that point. And at one point also, I did something which is not the first time it's ever happened, but it's very rare, where I did actually gasp out loud at something that happens in the carriage, and then immediately like, oh God, because it's never good when people talk out loud in public spaces in London.
I do that many, many times in this
But
book.
yeah, that really impressed me. But there is this curious overlay, isn't there, with the Dickens original? How did you feel about that, Sarah?
I liked that a lot because I think that we see Dickens in kind of a, like it's a snowy scene and people have those fingerless gloves on, the characters do. And it's a long time ago, back when there was a big difference between the wealthy and the poor were forgotten about. And that is exactly how we're living now. It's 100% the same. And this book captures that well and in an area that's unknown to a lot of people. And yeah, I thought it was done really, really well and kind of eye-opening. And it gets into the Oxy crisis really well. And it takes place in the 90s. So he's just a couple years younger than me. So if you're reading it, a middle-aged person reading it now, this person's a little bit younger than you and you can kind of see how it all unfolds, how it makes sense, how it happened.
Yes, I think the way that she made it feel relevant and contemporary, while also based on this Victorian novel, was extraordinary, I thought. And also I felt like that relevance and that message that's within it felt to me like the thing that kind of almost like kicked it into prize category. It's not just a great read. It's not just a thumping good story. There's actually something in there. She's trying to teach us something. She's trying to raise awareness about something. And it didn't feel...
But the story takes the lead in that.
Exactly,
the story is the most... It never is not the most important part.
Yeah.
She does it through character as well, right? So you have Mr. Armstrong, his teacher, who's black and has come down from the northern states and is trying to teach his young students about the structural inequalities that have governed their region and enforced their poverty for hundreds of years. The kids can't really take it in, or they're like, nah, no, it's our fault. So he's up against this brainwashing. And then there's June, the neighbor's daughter, who's also a nurse, who's on the front line of the crisis. So she is an expert in what's happening. And we hear towards the end about how she's been involved in the lawsuits against Purdue. Yeah, it was eye-opening, even as someone who thinks I'm relatively informed about the opioid crisis.
The companion book, although you don't need to have read it in the same way you don't need to have read David Copperfield, I think, but is Patrick Radden Keefe's nonfiction book, Empire of Pain, which is about the opioid crisis. And if you have read that, you're not really surprised by anything. It's seeing that story dramatized, I suppose. And it felt very resonant to me because of that. But equally, I think if you hadn't got that much background, it wouldn't matter. She's bringing it to your attention in, I thought, a really
it was
wonderful way.
like Dope Sick. Is that what that novel's? I don't know the book you're talking about, but I'd seen the television show Dope Sick, which is kind of the same subject as this.
Yeah, I don't know, because I never watch any TV.
Yeah.
So all those references.
I stopped because it was so depressing. It lacked the humor and character of of this book, which kept me going. I'm trying to find a funny quote, something I laughed at.
There's a way of speaking that people have in this novel that obviously is very true to this region that I absolutely loved. And every so often, just the way someone would say something was so perfectly captured. I really enjoyed that about this novel. Nina, how about you?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the opioid crisis and thinking, I don't know really much about it because I live here and we don't have an opioid crisis in the same way here. I read in the paper a lot about it and I think, what is that? I mean, I really ought to know more about it. I had a vague sense of it, but I did find that really educational. On the voice side, I don't know. I've never been to Appalachia, so I haven't heard those voices for real like you have, Sarah, so you'd know. I think what I found difficult was the switch. I sometimes felt like I got the voice and sometimes I didn't. And I found that a bit tricky, but it might be because I've never been there and I actually haven't heard those people.
So, yeah, I would say that sometimes he's like in the story and sometimes it feels more reflective.
Yeah.
I agree. So,
Yeah.
like, I found this one feels funny to me. He's describing a man that his Aunt June, who he likes, is dating. Looking down on him, I could see a pink shine on top of his head with the dark hair pulled across it. Not a full Homer Simpson like Creaky's, but a little beginner's hamburger helper up there. But do you trust a guy that cheats on his own head? Aunt June was bottom feeding. So that's him being funny. And then I had another one where he's being reflective, and as you're saying, maybe gets out of his voice. A 10-year-old getting high on pills? Foolish children. This is what we're meant to say. Look at their choices, leading to a life of ruin. But lives are getting lived right now, this hour, down in the dirty cracks between the toothbrush nighty-nights and the full grocery carts, where those words don't pertain. Children, choices, ruin. That was the labor and materials we were given to work with. An older boy that never knew safety himself, trying to make us feel safe. We had the moon in the window to smile on us for a minute and tell us the world was ours, because all the adults had gone off somewhere and left everything in our hands.
Yeah, I did love...
He doesn't sound 10.
No, he doesn't sound 10. No, exactly.
It is justified later. Towards the very end, there is a hint about when and why he's telling this story.
Yes, but he does switch back and forth between reflecting on the story and being in the story.
One thing I really loved about the book was the description of an understanding of what it's like in the foster system. Yeah. And I found that actually more moving than the backdrop of the Oxy crisis. I found the social injustice about fostering and the way the system just completely sidelines all these children. I found that incredibly moving.
Yeah.
And I thought she did that best from the bit that I read. That was the bit I felt really connected to, really sad about. And I thought she did a really good job of demonstrating how that injustice, that everything's put on these children to sort stuff out when the grown-ups should be sorting it out. And I thought that was really, really well done.
The one thing I would say is, while I appreciated the accomplished way that she wove together her story that she wanted to tell and Dickens's novel, I thought she ran into trouble with it towards the end, and I felt like characters were doing things that didn't really make sense to me unless they were something that happened in David Copperfield, which I've only seen the film, I've never read it. So that bothered me because for the first time, suddenly I was pulled out of this narrative. I didn't quite believe in these characters. I didn't quite believe they were doing the things that they were doing because having set herself this kind of structure, she then had to see it through. I'm only saying that because we're trying to evaluate these books and find some reason for saying, well, I think this one should win, I think this one shouldn't. Because, you know, frankly, comparing them all is just the most ridiculous thing in the world. But I did think that was the one thing as I read it, I was like, I'm just not sure that works that well. It's a slight shame in an otherwise completely extraordinary book. That's what I thought.
I would agree on that point, having not got to the end, but that's sort of what I meant at the beginning when I said I got somehow distracted or pulled away from the story by the David Copperfield bubbling along in the background. And I did get the sense that I was in this constant mode of comparison between the characters in this book and that book. And I found that frustrating, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, let's come back to it. Let's move on. We've got a lot to get through.
Move on to another extraordinary book in the sense of extraordinary and uniquely one of a kind.
I'm out.
We are going to be discussing next Pod by Laline Paul, which tells the story of Aya, a spinner dolphin who has always felt like an outsider. She suffers from a type of deafness and can't spin the way the others in her pod can. After tragedy strikes, Aya is forced to strike out on her own and discovers dangers everywhere, both from fellow sea dwellers and from human intervention. The audiobook is read by Finty Williams and published by Hachette. Here's a clip.
Half dreaming at the surface, Aya wakes in an instant, her reflexes always on high alert. But it is only a wild and lusty chase. The young couple leap, splash back down, and then, twirling in their bubbles, join together belly to belly. Aya admires their dance. Some things never change. Others do. Within 3 generations, this pod has racially blended into a new tribe, that mixes spinner grace with bottlenose strength. Like all the old, Ea finds the young more beautiful every day. But she would not go back. Time goes so fast now anyway. Calves barely weaned and now mating. Dusks and dawns racing each other, as if the whole ocean has accelerated to a new rhythm. She does not mind, because it means reunion comes closer, with the ocean, and with one whose heart still beats in hers. Since the seasons blurred, the moons lost their meaning, and it is not for her to dictate the spawning of fish or coral. It is odd, at this time of her life, to miss the rituals she so resisted when she was young. Perhaps none of this would have happened if she had not. Everything broke apart, but Ea no longer blames herself. What happened was bigger than any fault of hers.
Women's Prize judge Irinosa Nkoje is a fan, quoted inside the book as saying any Lillian Poole book release is something to get excited about. Truly a distinctive force. Laura balked at Talking Dolphins, but Nina, you read this one with me. Did you find this a powerful read?
Oh, I don't know. I would say while I was reading it, I found it pretty ridiculous. I was reading along thinking, this is ridiculous. I was laughing out loud. I was actually reading it on a plane and kept guffawing. And I would read bits and think, this is so ridiculous. But then when I finished it, I then spent the entire weekend talking about it. And finding weird analogies in what people said. They'd say something about the planet and I'd say, oh, that's just like in Pod, the book I just read and laughed at while I was reading it. I think the difficulty I had with it was I didn't think the writing was very beautiful. I don't know, for me, it's important that it's beautiful sounding and it reads beautifully. And I didn't really get that with this book. But I guess the outline or the story at the end, when you've gone through it all, you think, oh, wow, okay, I get there's a powerful message, I guess, with the book. But I didn't love it.
I think for me, so much depends on how you felt about The Bees, her previous book. She's written others, but The Bees was the one I loved and I thought was such an effective story of life set in a beehive. And anticipation was high for me when it came to dolphins, because I just thought, you know what? I know she can do stories about things that can't talk. Bees, pheromones, dolphins, underwater, sonar. There's a whole communication system. And I actually almost approached this, I think. I felt comfortable with it because it felt to me like a really good fantasy novel. Nothing made sense to me. You're thrown literally in at the deep end. Nothing's really explained. You have to figure things out. And at the beginning, I was very worried about what kind of dolphin is this and what species is this? It's not clear, but there is this very strong sort of narrative that certainly pulled me through. And I did really care about this character of this dolphinia. And I worried about what happened to her. And I thought the emotional notes that Poole strikes with this dolphin and her feelings about the other dolphins in her pod and her mother and herself and the kind of being she is and finding some kind of peace and happiness and all of that really resonated with me. And I cared about her and the other dolphins. It does get a bit strange at times. I agree, you could describe it as a bit over the top. There's a type of fish called a wrasse, who is an important character, and he undergoes a sex change, and then he finds himself attracted to a bunch of clams. I pulled out a little bit to read. The wrasse stared at the darkening muscular siphons, retracting into the shelves now that the clams had finished feeding. Then he felt his body touched by 6 warm jets of water as they blew up at him, as if teasing him. At that thought, he felt a quickening in his body. It was a thrillingly new kind of sexual arousal, mixing that of a lord male for his ladies with the fertile languor of the females. Without meaning to, he started to dance and flutter like a female, alternating with the muscular movements of a dominant male. He glanced upward, but the fugu was not there to mock. That's his sort of friend he's made, this fugu fish. And you know, I feel you're either willing to go with this sort of thing or you're not. And I actually was.
Kate,
I just really early on decided to just go with it. And as a result, I had a really good experience with this book. I really loved it.
You're much more open-minded
Yes,
than I
yes,
am.
absolutely. But also, her writing is is purple the right word? She is not a very good writer.
I I don't know about good. You know, post Thursday Murder Club, I'm thinking about ruling out the term good. It's no longer a term that I think can be used
all right, which is fair.
to qualify anything.
Her sentences are clunky and she over-explains and they're long and there's a lot of exposition. And
didn't find them clunky.
And I should say I only read the first 10% because I wasn't willing to pay for it. She has this thing where they're all dolphins. That's fine. But she calls them people and persons.
Yes.
And it's just very confusing.
No, I agree. I did pick up on that. So every so often, I thought one of the things I thought she did really convincingly and really well was this alien world, and she actually brought it to life in a way that I believed in. But every once in a while, she would slip up, and that use of the word person to describe a dolphin really bothered me. I thought, if you're going to have to say that, why don't you say being or you know, I was literally stopping reading to try and think of other words that I felt might have worked better. And that's never good. If your reading experience is interrupted by, you know, you as a reader thinking, well, could I suggest another word there? You know that's not good. So I stumbled over that a couple of times. I did.
And I do think she's probably thought about it very carefully. And she wanted us to believe and buy into the idea that these dolphins are as much people as you and me, but it's hard. I appreciate your desire to read it simply as fantasy. I think you get a gold star for a reading attitude.
Nina keeps pulling up this quote on her phone, and I need to know what she's laughing to herself about.
I'm laughing because you just read the bit about the clams. I sent Sarah a little excerpt when I was on the plane that said, "You're really missing out." And it's a similar one. It says, he began to feel the way they pulled water toward them, so that as they fluttered and pulsed their mantles, he understood they were feeding on what he could not see, but he felt their hunger, their satisfaction, and also their sexual excitement. And I literally was just squealing. I mean, I think the plane must have thought I was losing it. But first of all, it's also, I agree, Laura, terrible writing. I mean, it was like reading a Fabio romance novel when I was 15. I was embarrassed about that stuff. And the people thing I found really difficult. However, as I said, then I kept referring back to it, because what I did find amazing about it was thinking about the way all of these creatures under the sea live their lives, this idea that they have these highways, these waterways, these sound waves that they use to find places, and what happens when humans intervene aggressively and change the way that those things work, and how lost they all become. And that was really sad. And I really choked up at the end of the book. I found that really a bit overwhelming. I found I wanted to know more. And in fact, I then spent 2 hours Googling stuff at the end, because I thought, do they really use dolphins in military testing? Oh, they do, you know. Yeah. So I found what I learned from it really interesting. But yeah, I think the way it was written was not ideal.
Yeah, so that's the two things to say. You know, one is the distress that all these beings are in these oceans. And we know why. Ia and the dolphins and the whales and the wrasse, they don't know. And I thought she handled that perspective absolutely brilliantly, this disconnect between what these characters in her novel know and what you, the reader, know. And that is why I thought it was pretty extraordinary in the way it did that, the effectiveness with which she did that, and the feelings it evokes in you of guilt and a broader understanding. And the other thing I would say is that I described it as a fantasy novel, and in a way, I think my willingness to go with it was because I was very comfortable thinking of it in those terms. But this is not a fantasy. Every single damn thing in this book is true. It's based on a credible amount of research. And, you know, you're kind of aware of that as you're reading it. And I think then the way she describes, you know, the nets and the dolphins caught in the nets and just dying. And it's not like just reading about it on a website or a news program. You know, you really feel it because you're living this life through this character. And I just thought all that was wonderful. And the only other thing I thought was a couple of weeks ago, there was a headline about orca whales attacking boats, leading to the headline in the Daily Telegraph. Killer whales learn to sink yachts off Gibraltar. And that was quite a big story when that went around. And when I heard it, I was just like, well, I know why they're doing that.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't have to think. I immediately and instinctively saw that situation from the whale's point of view because I'd read Pod. And so I love it for that. I think writers who are trying to communicate and say something about experience and life and the world that we're all living in are collectively coming up against climate change and the devastating impact humans are having on the natural world, and with mixed results trying to address it. And I love Lillian Hall's take on it. I thought she did such a great job. And I was so happy this made the shortlist. I do feel like they threw it in there as a bit of a divisive wild card. But I personally was so pleased it was on there and very glad to have read it. Right, we must move on. Trespassers by Louise Kennedy. Her novel set in 1970s Northern Ireland. The story is narrated by Cushla, who lives with her mother and in the evenings works in the family pub run by her brother. During the day, she teaches at the local school. Generally, she navigates the tension between her own Catholic community and the local Protestant community with the expertise that comes with lifelong familiarity. But when she meets Michael, a married Protestant man from Belfast, and falls for him, she starts to realise just how much she is required to obey unwritten social rules. The audiobook is read by Brid Brennan and published by Bloomsbury. Here's a clip.
Cushla wrapped her handbag in her coat and pushed it into the gap between the beer fridge and the till. Her brother Eamon was bent over the counter with a stock list. He looked up at her and his eyes narrowed. He inclined his head at the mirror that ran the length of the bar. Cushla leaned in to check her reflection. Father Slattery had marked her with a thick cross 1 inch wide and 2 inches long. The rub of her finger raised the piney, resinous scent of whatever blessed unguent the ashes were mixed with, and blurred the cruciate shape to a sooty smudge. Eamon slapped a wet serviette into her hand. "Hurry up," he hissed. Most of the men who drank in the pub did not get ashes on Ash Wednesday, or do the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday, or go to Mass on Sunday. It was one thing to drink in a Catholic-owned bar, quite another to have your pint pulled by a woman smeared in papish war paint. Cushla buffed until the skin on her forehead was pink. The serviette blackened, flittered. She tossed it in the bin. Eamon muttered something under his breath. The only word she could make out was Egypt.
Trespassers has met with much critical acclaim. It's been a book of the year for the Times, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, the Telegraph, the Irish Times, the Washington Post, to name just a few. Fellow author and critic Brandon Taylor says, thrilling, wise and moving, Trespassers is a remarkable novel about the wages of love in a time marked by brutality, strife, and above all, a will to hope. A totally absorbing read. Nina, you again. You read this one with me.
Yeah.
How did you get on with Kushla's story?
I really liked this book a lot. I'll start with things I didn't like about it. I found it a little bit predictable. So maybe it was like I was sort of reading it, wondering what was going to happen next, imagining what was going to happen next, and what happened next was what I had imagined. But at the same time, I don't know, I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland in the mid-90s, but in a Protestant environment. And so I really liked the flip that this gave me, where it's told from the perspective of a Catholic woman. I thought the pace of the book was really amazing. The writing was very sensory. And that, for me, was sort of like how it was when I was there. Everything was a bit dreamlike, weirdly. My memories of it are intense. I thought it was great. I really loved the story. I loved the way that the love story unfolded. I really enjoyed it.
I don't quite know what I expected from it. I think it was that classic thing where, because it has been so celebrated, I maybe expected slightly more from it than I got. And I also have to acknowledge my own personal, it's always about what you personally like and dislike. And there's a lot of this novel is set in the pub. And I really hate pubs. I hate them.
I didn't know what you were going to say, but I didn't think it was going to be that.
No, I just, I'm probably thinking as well of just horrible, smelly English pub. I mean, maybe some lovely Irish pub would charm me, but it's just all about the sort of sticky bar counter and the cigarettes on the floor and the sort of dodgy blokes in the corner and just everything about it I really didn't like. And so combine that with the sort of generally quite claustrophobic atmosphere of this, I found it a slightly uncomfortable read, but that's not to say I didn't like it. There was much to like in it. I would have loved to have cared about the characters more than I did. And so when events befall them later on in the novel, I kind of felt like I'd just seen it coming. I know what it was. I'd seen it coming from the very beginning. And so I almost steeled myself, I think, and deliberately didn't get too involved. I almost felt like the author was doing that as well, so that when then things happen, I didn't really mind as much as almost like I wanted to mind. And I felt that was down to her and the job she'd done in building these characters. They just perhaps weren't quite deep enough for me. But there's so much nuance and tension there, and the social situation I thought was really beautifully depicted, and I did really enjoy reading that. And I absolutely would recommend it to people. It's a great read.
I thought the detachment was on purpose. And I felt that as well. That's what I meant about that intense pace and that sense of things being slightly dreamlike. Maybe my personal experience there was also weirdly detached because there was always this anxiety bubbling underneath that something was going to happen. You didn't know when or where. Something unjust might happen or something violent might happen. And so I think that people who grew up in that time, there are people who have that detachment. They couldn't connect in the way we could in our cozy upbringings where we didn't have basically a war happening. And so I liked that detachment because I felt that absolutely too, but I felt like that was the way it was. Horrible things happen all through the book, but you do anticipate them. And that's what it was like, I think, then. The other thing that I found really interesting about it was the sexism. There's so much sexism in this book.
So
and
depressing.
It made me crazy. I was so angry reading it and getting so frustrated. You know, this woman, her brother, the patriarch, she's working for free in the pub, and yet he's still controlling her life and telling her what she can and cannot do. And it seems completely wrong. But then at the same time, because of the context, you think, but he's terrified.
And tried to protect her.
Exactly. So his cruelty to her is also protection. And I think there was a lot of that in that time. And I thought she evoked that really well. I mean, obviously I was there 20 years after this book took place, but I definitely got that from people. There was a kind of shell around people that existed. And the pub, I've been to those pubs. They were exactly as described. They're stinky, they're cigarette ends. And I love the way she did things to show how hard it was. This is a Catholic family running a pub in a Protestant area. And people come in, even though they're nice customers, but they still grind their cigarettes into the carpet just to make a point. And I found that quite moving, actually. And also it made me really angry.
It's so depressing. I just feel like, you know, as a conflict, like everything about it was so depressing. Like just, I mean, you know where it comes from and, you know, history and the context that people found themselves in this divided country, and it wasn't anyone's fault. I think we know whose fault it was.
Yeah.
So you see the aftermath of all that and how things played out, but it just feels so depressing that this is what humans turn to in that situation. It's like really just, depressing.
One last thing I'd say about it was, I guess because it is, I think, the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement just took place recently. And I guess I was also thinking a lot about Northern Ireland. When I read this book, I thought everyone should read this book because people don't appreciate how important that event was. And so I did think it was probably quite timely that it came out this year.
The other thing I loved was I did love the way she structured it. It starts at one point in time, it then goes back, and then it returns. And I thought the way she did that and then allowing for this reflection and the sense that we have that so much time has passed and yet the repercussions are still so evident, that was done absolutely beautifully. So there was so much to like in it. I messaged our friend Jenny McCulloch, who is from Northern Ireland and appeared on the podcast when we did Milkman by Anna Burns, the book that won the Booker. I was just curious to know someone who's from there, her take on it. She said, I didn't love it as much as I wanted to, or everybody else does. And some of it I thought and felt was really terrific. Some of it I just didn't quite believe. Maybe the problem lies with me. So yeah, there's Jenny's thoughts, and we know mine on pubs. Let's move on.
Okay, now we turn to Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks. Yame lives for the weekend, when she can go raving with her friends at the Crypt, an underground club in an industrial town on the outskirts of London. A young woman unsure of her future, the sound is her guide, a chance to discover who she really is in the rhythms of those smoke-filled nights. In the dance hall darkness, dub is the music of her soul, her friendships, her ancestry. But everything changes when she meets Moose, the man she falls deeply in love with and who offers her the chance of freedom and escape. When their relationship is brutally cut short, Yame goes on a dramatic journey of transformation, where past and present collide with explosive consequences. The audiobook is published by Penguin Audio and read by Leonie Elliott. Let's hear a clip.
"1 o'clock in the morning, hotfoot, all three of us, stepping where we had no business. Tombstone estate gals, Caribbean, Irish. No one expects better. We ain't it, but we sure ain't shit. All we need is a little bit of rhythm, so we got in it, deep into the dance hall crypt. Come now, Asase calls, pushing her way down the stairs, high priestess glow, red Ankara cloth wound round her hair like a towering inferno. Asase is the oldest, 25, a year older than me and Ruma. Ruma is nothing like her red-haired Irish family. My gal is dance-taught, tall with a rubber-ribbed belly, androgynous, blonde. She dyes her hair obsidian black, stuffs it underneath a knitted red gold-green rasta cap. We squeeze past chirpsing men, stand in front of the arch wooden door, suck in the last of the O2. I follow Asase inside. My gal follows the smoke. Beneath barrel-vaulted arches, dance-hall darkness, pile-up bodies, ganja clouds. We lean against flesh-eating limestone walls near 2 coffin-sized speaker boxes that vibrate us into the underworld.
Listening to that makes me wish I'd read this one on audio, which I did wonder about at the time. It's so great to have a sense of the music in there.
So I read this book without actually listening to any dub reggae during. I imagined dub reggae sounding very different to how it actually sounds, or at least how I think it now sounds based on some YouTubing. I just listened to an interview with Jacqueline Crooks. This is a debut novel from her. And she was a 15-year-old girl going to this underground scene. She was saying how, really she was far too young to be there. But with this book, she wanted to recreate a lost world and her time in it. And it is like being parachuted into another time and place that is very foreign to my own background and experience, and really exciting for that reason, among others.
I read a bit of this one, but I didn't make it all the way through. Sarah and Laura, you both read all of it. Sarah,
Yeah.
How did you get on with it?
Well, I agree with you that you're transported to another world. I was trying to find a quote that captures because it starts off in dialect and you really feel kind of lost in the beginning. Not lost, but
At sea.
I just felt really uncool. I felt like they were really cool, going to the club and dressing really cool. And I just felt like a very square, white, middle-class woman reading this after my kids go to bed. And I liked that. I liked being humbled by that. There's a lot going on in here. One thing I wanted to mention, you were saying how you hate pubs. I, for some reason, really love underground imagery. And there's a lot that takes place underground in this novel. They go to the clubs underground. People live underground. She lives underground for a while. Very important things happen underground. And some of them are in buildings underground. Some of them are in caves. Some of them are in these crazy systems. Some of them are slave escape routes. And it really reminded me of fairy tales and stuff that I read growing up that have a big underground scene. I know that she was doing things with it about the slave trade and having to live underground and celebrate and be loud and do art underground and also escape and hide underground. All of those things were her reasons for doing it. But as a reader, it also felt, I don't know, kind of magical. There was this magic in it too.
It starts off without a lot of plot. So I read about, 30 to 50 pages and then read other things for 3 weeks. And I only went back to it over this past weekend because we had the podcast. And so I had a deadline and I was like, oh, okay, all right, I'll go back to it. And then suddenly there's this traumatic event, which I should have seen coming, but didn't. And then the plot really takes off and goes in different directions as Yame changes her life in significant ways and travels, going, I think it's on the flap, so it's not a spoiler to say, going so far as traveling back to Jamaica, which is where her parents came from. And so it gets really pacey as well as being, I think, eye-opening.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny that you did that because I read it on my phone, so I didn't have a sense of pages and kind of got into it. Once I sort of got the language, it hits you like a double punch, what happens. And I thought, oh shit, is this going to be like a soap opera? This is way too much happening right now. And then you realize it's treated like she's reeling from those things, like reckoning with them. And they are treated with weight, and it doesn't go on like a soap opera. But it does get quite pacey and exciting as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which I didn't see coming from the pace of the opening quarter or whatever it was. I'm not surprised this is a debut novel in some ways. I think it's a great book. I think she'll write better books. I was interested to read a bit more about her. Jacqueline Crooks grew up in 70s and 80s Southall, part of London's migrant community, and she was very invested in music, culture, and politics, just like our protagonist. She was also immersed in the gang underworld as a young woman, and then later discovered the power of writing and music to help her look outwards and engage differently with the world. And that has driven her ever since, from her work with charities to her short stories. Some of her short stories won the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction. She's also been recognised with the Wasafiri New Writing Prize and the BBC National Short Story Award. Interesting to see Bernardine Evaristo has been a champion of this book. She has a quote on the back. "I was blown away by Fire Rush, an exceptional and stunningly original novel by a major new writer." And I would agree with all of that.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think it's a voice that needs to be heard. I mean, this is a big population, a big migrant population in England. And I've never read a book like this before.
Yeah, in the interview, I was hearing her say she did also want to create a historical artifact in some ways. Because the dub reggae scene was underground, literally, not a lot was known about it. And so she wanted to write to those experiences, to those worlds, and surface it as a part of British history.
And to go along with that, there's a lot about historical artifacts in this novel. Moose, her boyfriend, is helping make them. There's later people who are divers who dive wrecked slave ships, archaeologists. And there's a big part about police brutality. So there was a lot of political importance in this novel as well.
I didn't manage to read very much of it, but that was very frustrating to me because I've absolutely loved what I've read so far. I think her writing has this wonderful sort of shimmering quality. It's wonderfully evocative. You get sort of sound and taste and smell, and it's quite a sensual novel in a way that I really loved. And yeah, I just really want to know how things turn out. So I will absolutely be finishing it, and I wonder how
you
it will
have
do.
no idea. You are not going to guess at all what happens. And I mean that in the best way. It's great.
All right, we must move on. Let's turn to Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. Sarajevo, spring 1992. Each night, nationalist gangs erect barricades, splitting the diverse city into ethnic enclaves. Each morning, the residents, whether Muslim, Croat or Serb, push the makeshift barriers aside. Zora, an artist and teacher, is focused on her family, her students, her studio in the old town. But when violence finally spills over, she sees that she must send her husband and elderly mother to safety with her daughter in England. Reluctant to believe that hostilities will last more than a handful of weeks, she stays behind. As the city falls under siege and everything they loved is laid to waste, black ashes floating over the rooftops, Zora and her friends are forced to rebuild themselves over and over. Inspired by real-life accounts of the longest siege in modern warfare, only 30 years ago, Black Butterflies is a portrait of disintegration, resilience, and hope. The audiobook is read by Rachel Atkins and published by W.F. Howes. Here's a clip.
It sometimes seemed to Zora that, with all the teaching and curating and meetings and paperwork and caring and cooking and cleaning and errands, she is floundering at the midpoint of her life. There's no time left over for the core of her. Perhaps at 55 she's beyond the midpoint now, but she'd always imagined that these years, her child grown and gone, herself not yet old, would be her most spacious and productive. She'd pictured herself spending long, blissful days in her studio, but instead, everything else always encroaches. There's the forward rhythm of the tram and the rattle of the dusty window panes. The worry. She presses her forehead to the glass, drinking in her city at this strange hour. The wind carries twisting flyers down the street, and the mountains waver in the pre-dawn light. The outlines of things, buildings, frozen cars, a sleeping drunk, are porous. The threshold between night and day feels uncertain, as if she could just as easily slip back into the night as go forwards into the day.
So this book has the distinction of being the only book that has been read by all four of your book podcasters today. Nina, should we start with you? How did you get on?
I did really like it. similar to Trespasses in the sense that it's about war. It's about this very specific time that wasn't actually that long ago. And I found it incredibly moving because of the fast and slow pace that it happened at. It was like you're kind of watching a slow car crash, but also, if that makes sense, you're sort of in it very quickly. You can't believe people are making all sorts of bad decisions. You already know the outcome. So it's like watching a horror film where you say, no, don't go down the stairs. No, stay inside. So there was a lot of that for me. I read it feeling anxious, even though I knew the outcome of that siege. I found it very moving to think about how a city, Sarajevo, which I knew nothing about other than it had hosted the Olympics. And all of a sudden, I feel after reading this that I really wish I could have gone to that city before and experienced this amazing multicultural harmony that it seemed to exist there. It feels really sad to read it actually and think about that things have changed so much and that they changed so quickly. I found some things a little bit trite, but I think probably it's just because it's almost so overwhelming. It's such an emotional book that I found some of the moments a little bit predictable. I kind of imagined some of the things that happened would happen, and they did happen, and they probably did happen in real life, which is one of the issues that you're hit with. The other thing I found interesting about it, I guess, is the power of culture and of art and how that has to be destroyed. You know, when people... And I found that amazing. And obviously, you know, don't want to ruin it for everyone, but this amazing moment where the black butterflies sort of happen in the book, and the sense that this culture of all these people has just been obliterated. And that always seems to be the thing that these people come and do because they're so scared of art and poetry and historical artifacts. I did really like it. And I was sad at the end, I have to say. I might have had a few tears.
Sarah, how about you?
I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot from it, and at the same time didn't. Like, I could absolutely read a nonfiction account of what is happening. You do feel it's written in the third person, but you feel lost like the main character. You don't understand why this is happening. And she's a bit naive about how things are going to go better, or maybe too hopeful. But then you also see that that's what carries her when things are really bad. I don't think I would be as hopeful, but I also see that helped her be more resilient and build more community of what was left over. There's this whole leftovers community. I loved how it opened. I don't know that I've read a war novel told from the perspective of a non-fighting 55-year-old kid-grown woman who's also fairly well-to-do. I mean, at one point, she trades an Hermes scarf for a bunch of garlic, you know, and you really love her. You really care about her.
I think when I compare this novel to Fire Rush, a key difference for me is the characterization, and that you feel as if you know Zora and really, really understand her motivations and why she makes the decisions she makes, why she makes that decision to stay. I found this book so devastating. In some ways, it was familiar because there's a book by a Canadian author called The Cellist of Sarajevo, which is about a true story, which is that a cellist went out to play in the streets of Sarajevo, at least for some duration of the siege, and the snipers didn't shoot him. Interestingly, that novel doesn't identify anyone's background or faith, whereas Black Butterflies is really quite expositional in a good way, I think, about the makeup of Sarajevo and the faiths. What I found really haunting, and I mean, in some ways, this is, again, so naive, but Zora cannot believe that war is coming. And we say war, but really it's a siege. She can't believe it's coming because Sarajevo, these are the facts she gives us, but is half Muslim, a quarter Serb, 1/10 Croat. A third of marriages are mixed, and they're all Slavic people, so they don't look different. And it's interesting when we counter these conflicts around the world, as outsiders, you're kind of looking to try and make sense of what is the origin for this hate. And ultimately, you know, there's nothing there. Humans in different contexts with different histories. I cried, definitely cried. I loved how short this book was. I felt like she didn't overlabor it. She kept it really tight and clean and devastating. As you said, Nina, it was fast and slow. So sometimes it moved really quickly and other times it slowed right down.
Totally want to see the art that doesn't exist that's in it.
Oh, me too. I kept
like, I totally want the art show.
She did such a good job of describing the paintings.
Yeah.
And then I loved when she moved into creating art with what she had, and I got a real sense of what she made. I have no idea if what I imagined
with
is
pigeon
what
bones
Priscilla Morris imagined, but yeah.
Ashes and flower petals and
There's a lovely afterword where she writes about how there are two real-life stories that she conflates in this novel, and one is her own great-uncle's story, who was a Sarajevan landscape painter, and he experienced the events of the war and had to flee. And then she says, after a year of recovery with a kind English family in Wiltshire and his daughter and son-in-law in Bristol, Dobry regained his capacity to see the world anew. He started painting again and carried on for the next 2 decades until his death in 2015. In his brightly coloured check shirts, a daffodil in one buttonhole, he was an inspirational man, an embodiment of art, overcoming the destruction of war. That's just something to hold on to, isn't it, for Zora and for you as a reader, you know, that in the most terrible of circumstances, somehow there is still this thread of art, of music, of poetry. One of the main characters is a bookseller, so there are many scenes set in his bookshop, and this sense of culture and the importance of that and shared stories and communication and what that means to people in the extremists was really haunting. I also thought, you know, extraordinarily resonant, thinking about the idea that while people were suffering in Sarajevo, in other countries very close by, even regions close to the city, people were fine and they were able to live normal lives while this thing was going on, and these people were in such distress. And you can't help but think now about Ukraine and the situation there. It's so sad because you feel so helpless, you know, what can we do? Are we doing enough? I remember when the conflict first started, there was a real surge of sending what we could and welcoming people, refugees. But, you know, now it feels like, oh, is it still going on? And it's of course it is. It's actually, if anything, intensifying. So anyway, so much that I thought was really wonderful and extraordinary to read. The one thing I thought was there was a moment in this. Well, first of all, I didn't see things coming in the way that I did with Trespassers, and I really appreciated that. It did mean that I was that much more engaged when things happened. And the other was, I thought there was a moment where it was a real nadir, and yet she'd found something. She'd found a relationship with someone, and there was this moment of joy and happiness. And I thought at that point, I was so intently focused on this book. It sort of sharpened my investment, my involvement, everything. And I feel like there's something here. There's something. She's saying something in it. It's really important. But then I felt like it moved away. And when I finished it, I thought, that's a shame. There's something there, and it's in there. It's definitely in there. But again, just trying to evaluate it in terms of which I think should win the prize. If she had managed to sustain that somehow and weave that more completely through it, that would have been the thing that made it the prize winner for me. And I didn't feel she did that. And maybe that's because it's her first novel.
It did, the thing that you're referencing, I think it did stick with me. I think it did stick with her. I think people in war, I guess, these relationships, you have these moments, and then, you know, it's about survival. And it's about people being stuck in a situation, and then it's about, can you take care of yourself better? Is there a better option? And I think that's the shift, is having to choose.
Yeah. I don't know if she would have left as well if things had been slightly different, if she hadn't had such a loss later on in the book.
It's difficult to talk about it without spoiling it. Well,
I don't want to.
But it's very uncertain, isn't it, at the end? There was a sense of just abrupt change and not knowing. And that stayed with me for ages after I read it. Like, I wanted to know what happened, and I was kind of frustrated and stressed, and also thought, well, that's what it was like.
That's what she says. You know, you don't know. She doesn't know.
Yeah.
Why would she?
Must move on to our last, but very much not least, the marriage portrait.
Winter 1561, Lucrezia, Duchess of Ferrara, is taken on an unexpected visit to a country villa by her husband, Alfonso. As they sit down to dinner, it occurs to Lucrezia that Alfonso has a sinister purpose in bringing her here. He intends to kill her. Lucrezia is 16 years old and has led a sheltered life locked away inside Florence's grandest palazzo. Here in this remote villa, she is entirely at the mercy of her increasingly erratic husband. What is Lucrezia to do with this sudden knowledge? What chance does she have against Alfonso, ruler of a province and a trained soldier? How can she ensure her survival? The marriage portrait is a reimagining of the life of a young woman whose proximity to power places her in mortal danger. The audiobook is read by Genevieve Gaunt and published by Headline. Here's a clip.
A wild and lonely place. Fortezza near Bondeno, 1561. Lucrezia is taking her seat at the long dining table, which is polished to a watery gleam and spread with dishes, inverted cups, a woven circlet of fur. Her husband is sitting down, not in his customary place at the opposite end, but next to her, close enough that she could rest her head on his shoulder should she wish. He is unfolding his napkin and straightening a knife and moving the candle towards them both when it comes to her with a peculiar clarity, as if some coloured glass has been put in front of her eyes, or perhaps removed from them, that he intends to kill her. She is 16 years old, not quite a year into her marriage. They have travelled for most of the day, using what little daylight the season offers, leaving Ferrara at dawn and riding out to what he had told her was a hunting lodge, far in the northwest of the province. But this is no hunting lodge, is what Lucrezia had wanted to say when they reached their destination, a high-walled edifice of dark stone, flanked on one side by dense forest, and on the other by a twisting meander of the Po River. She would have liked to turn in her saddle and ask, "Why have you brought me here?" She said nothing, however, allowing her mare to follow him along the path, through dripping trees, over the arch-backed bridge, and into the courtyard of the strange, fortified, star-shaped building, which seemed, even then, to strike her as peculiarly empty of people.
So as with Kingsolver, this is a much lauded book. It was a Reese's Book Club pick, instant Sunday Times, New York Times and Irish Times bestseller because Maggie O'Farrell has such a reputation. I think she's probably an auto-buy author for a lot of people. Guardian and Lit Hub Book of the Year. The reviews on the back, the iNewspaper said, every bit as evocative and spellbinding as Hamnet. O'Farrell, thank God, just seems to be getting better and better. And The Spectator said, in O'Farrell's hands, historical detail comes alive. And of course, she is a previous winner of the Women's Prize itself back in 2020 for Hamnet, a novel about Shakespeare and the death of his son. So, Laura, it's like old times. It's you and me for this one.
Which is actually slightly problematic because I don't think I've been a very good reader of this book. I bought it a long time ago, pre-award prep, and I found it boring, and I skimmed it. And then I came back to it a couple of days ago. And what I should say is that it's my first Maggie O'Farrell book. So I'm not sure if it's a me and Maggie issue or if it's the novel itself. Obviously, I am the outlier here because everyone else in the world loves this book and loves Maggie O'Farrell.
Oh, I don't know. I've read mixed, definitely reader reviews, maybe not the critical newspaper reviews,
right.
But I felt have been a bit mixed. My impression is a lot of people are disappointed that it wasn't Hamnet 2. I think people loved Hamnet so much, and I did. How do you follow on from a book that meant so much to so many and was such an extraordinary piece of work? Can The Marriage Portrait live up to those expectations? And I think for a lot of people, it didn't. And that was what I wondered about it once I'd read it myself, and then I was reflecting back on the reviews I'd read.
Well, you loved Hamnet. Did you love this one?
I thought this book was completely extraordinary. I think Maggie O'Farrell is on another level. I think she is writing to such a pitch of kind of performance and skill and nuance and so beautifully structured. And this character, Lucrezia O'Farrell, has conjured her up from the flimsiest of real life evidence of her existence. We have a portrait that exists of her, and then there is a reference to her in a Robert Browning poem, which I think O'Farrell knew. And she felt moved to recreate the life of this woman, and also is very interested in this practice that happened at that time of basically, matricide? Getting rid of the inconvenient spouse when she doesn't produce the heir that you married her for.
Yes, I actually found the author's note one of the most interesting things about the book. And it did introduce me to that term, but gosh, where is it? UXOR-icide. Uxoricide? Uxoricide.
What's matricide then when you kill your mother? Oh, Lena's nodding.
Yeah.
Uxoricide, that's not a term you hear very often. So many things I loved about this. It's the extraordinary depiction of the life of this Renaissance woman and the environments that she would have moved in and the experience that she would have had. I thought all of that was just perfection. I felt like I was stepping through Renaissance painting after Renaissance painting. And I studied art history, and one of the things I specialised in was Renaissance art. So for me, there was such joy in seeing this world brought to life so beautifully and captivatingly. And then there is also this almost like political angle, or certainly this feminist angle, I suppose, in that, her outrage at the treatment of this particular woman, but by extension, other women at that time and women at any time. You know, you just go further and further out the ripples up to the present day. I mean, it's just, you know, it's so disturbing. And she's using her fiction and this story to tell this story, but really make you think about a much larger story. And I thought that was so beautifully done. I think one of the things people who are critical of it were saying is that it's quite a claustrophobic novel. Her life is incredibly circumscribed. She can't ever go out. She doesn't really leave the palazzo. And even within it, she's quite limited in the people that she's actually able to see. And I think people found that a flaw. I didn't find it that way. I was all the more impressed that she had managed to create such a rich portrait of this woman and her existence with such limited resources to tell the story. She really has to dig deep and be inventive. And I think she is such a flawless writer at this point. I was utterly convinced by it. I read it with a kind of intensity. I just knew as I was reading it, this is so good. This is so good. And this has been coming up a lot for me recently. Like, you know, what is good? What isn't good? What is bad writing? What is good writing? I'm not great at knowing how to pick things apart and say, oh, well, this is bad and this is good. All I know is my experience when I'm reading something and how I feel about it. And I loved this so much. I thought it was wonderful. And of all of them, maybe this is a slight preview to my thoughts about which should win, but for me, this is the one that I couldn't fault.
Well, I guess.
So that's where I am with it.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just the flip side where I couldn't get through it. So take that what you will.
It is it's an intense little read, and it's actually...
But it's not little, it's long.
Well, it's not long. How long is it?
In your stack, it's the longest one. And in my book, where it doesn't look quite...
Oh my God, it's 435 pages. If you'd asked me, I would have said it was like 200. I mean, oh my God. So a long read that doesn't feel like a long read, I would say.
Or a long read, you won't make it through.
Because this is the one I read first as well, so that's perhaps why I'm so surprised by it. I don't remember this as a long read at all.
I can't fault her writing. In many ways, I can only fault my reading.
It is an emotional journey. It's a very intense journey. And I could see as well, it's not perhaps one that everybody wants to be taken on. And in Hamnet, there was somehow this redemption, or the thing that lifted it was your sort of pleasure in the story of Anne, the mother, and the way that she, actually much like Zora in Black Butterflies, you know, she found art and nature and ways of reconnecting with life and to heal herself that really resonate very strongly and just felt like such a joy to read. This doesn't have that in such an obvious way, but the joy for me came in the way that she has taken this woman from history where she has been marginalized and ignored and actually killed, you know, the ultimate insult, and she's brought her to life. And I will never forget her, and I will never forget her story. And it's like it meant so much to me when I read it, and not only because it's this one specific story, but it made me think about all the stories, all the untold stories of all the women throughout history. And that's what Maggie O'Farrell's up to. And I just think it's extraordinary. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. So...
Well, we know which one Kate is going to choose. We don't need to hear from her again.
Let's have a think about which one we think should win, which one we want to win. But before we go to our thoughts, I did put the question to Bookstagram, and some people responded. At the Book Squares said Demon Copperhead for me, while the Daydreamer Diary said Demon, 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 Demon all the way. Pamela Hayes said she had a feeling it was going to be Demon Copperhead. The Left-Handed Reader said, this is tough for me. Demon or Trespassers. I loved both, although she admits she didn't read the others. It's true, not everyone does have the time or the inclination to read their way through an entire prize shortlist, as I think we all would acknowledge as well. It's not easy. Left-Handed Reader did say, as someone who was born in West Virginia and has spent time in the mountains of Appalachia, the setting and world rang very true to me. Una Pozzanghera Piccadilly commented, so far I have read Trespassers, thought it was okay, Pod, thought it was terrible, and Black Butterflies, thought it was perfect. Just started Fire Rush and looking forward to Demon Copperhead, so I'm pretty sure the Marriage Portrait will win. Presumably meaning the one furthest down her TBR list will end up winning it. Jill Bone Needs Trouble said, I've only read Demon Copperhead, Trespassers and the Marriage Portrait, and I loved all three, but I can't imagine a better book than Demon Copperhead. So, Nina, what would you love to win?
This is really hard.
You've read the ones you've read, and you've heard about the others.
I've heard the other ones, and I don't know, I guess I probably didn't think any of the ones I read were the best book I'd read this year. Of the ones I read, The one I liked the most was Trespassers. I guess I would hope that wins out of the 4 that I went through. I have a feeling either Demon Copperhead or The Marriage Portrait will win. That's just my spidey sense.
Sarah, how about you?
I've read Fire Rush, Black Butterflies, and Demon Copperhead. I have forced Demon Copperhead on more people, but I find that I am pushing Fire Rush on people a lot because I'm like, oh, you'd like it for this. Oh, you'd like it for this. I actually want that to have more airtime. So that's what I would like to have win.
I almost feel Fire Rush, and I've only read, the first third, but in a way that was the one that felt the most exciting to me. It felt the one that was really not quite like anything. Because Pod, for all it was a wild and crazy ride, I had read The Bees, and it was really like the underwater bees, which I loved, because I love the bees. So yeah, Fire Rush was the one where it really felt like something sort of rich and strange. Laura, how about you?
Well, I hope Demon Copperhead doesn't win.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why?
I think it's a great American novel in the tradition of other great American novels. And I think it's wonderful and finely crafted, but it doesn't feel, partially perhaps because it's based on David Copperfield, it doesn't feel especially new or forward-thinking or dynamic. It just feels perfectly contained in and of itself, but I don't want it to win. I also think it has more than enough exposure, so it shouldn't win. I would be delighted if Fire Rush won. I too really want to recommend this one to people, and I'm so happy I have a copy so that I can start passing it around to friends. But for me, it's Black Butterflies. I want Black Butterflies to win.
Yeah, interesting. I also think it's such a great shortlist. Like every single one of these novels, I love all of them for book club. You could put a pin in, take any one of these books, and it would be a fantastic book club read. Maybe especially Pod.
I agree with that. I think it was a really good shortlist this year. Really wide-ranging. The books are all very different.
And so in my strict evaluation of which one I thought was the best, it has to come down for me to The Marriage Portrait, but I feel like because Maggie O'Farrell has previously won it, I wonder whether maybe that would slightly rule this out. You wouldn't think that ought to weigh, but I sort of feel like, mightn't it though? Then that makes me think, it's so funny. Before we had this discussion, I would have said Demon Copperhead, because I just felt like that was the strongest of all the others, even though I have a massive issue with something being based on something else. This has come up before. It will come up again. I just think if something overtly is referencing something else, maybe that's why I have a slight issue with it. But, it's funny. After the discussion, I'm now thinking much more highly of the others, which for me were the best of the rest. But yeah, so hard to call.
Oh, come on now. You can't leave us there.
Well, so my personal preference is The Marriage Portrait. That is the one that I would vote for. I thought both O'Farrell and Kingsolver were in a different class from the others, and it just shows they're much more experienced writers. They're both extraordinary writers. To me, these two were books apart. But I don't know, because I almost wonder, because I didn't finish Fire Rush, and I'm just wondering about that, because I just thought that was so exciting and felt like a breath of fresh air in lots of ways. That would be a really interesting choice. I can't wait to find out. It's announced in just a few days. Well, thank you so much for reading these books and coming and discussing them with us. It's been absolutely brilliant, Nina and Sarah. And I look forward to finding out the prize and then hopefully strong-arming you into coming and talking about other books on another podcast.
It was really fun. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks.
That's nearly it for this episode. But if you're interested in a little bonus, keep listening at the very end to hear our reactions after the prize has been announced. This episode of the Book Club Review was edited and produced by me, Kate Slotover. Whenever you listen to it, if you have thoughts, Laura and I would love to hear them. Comment anytime on the episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, linked in the show notes, which is also the place to go for an episode transcript. Comments there go straight to our inboxes, so drop us a line. We always love to hear from you. Other links worthy of mention: if you're an Instagrammer, you can also comment under our episode post there, and I've included a link to help you find it. Plus the link to our bi-weekly-ish newsletter sign-up for extra reviews and recommendations between shows, and finally info about our Patreon stream and how you can support us there. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, do follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or get in touch direct at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you enjoy our shows and want to do a nice thing in return, please do leave us a quick star rating and review. Wondering how to do that? Check the show notes where you'll find a handy how-to guide. But for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.